Welcome back. We're now going to introduce the work of literature that is at the basis of this session, and which is also tied in with the special project that is due for this particular session, and which is described in a separate video in the group that you're watching for this session. And all of that is Ovid's Heroides. I might recommend that you pause the video and go to assignments and find the project document, the one called Special Project, and maybe get it out because you'll want to have that prepared so that you'll understand what to do when you go to the video on the Special Project. But for right now, we're going to talk about the literary character of Ovid's Heroides. Now, we're not going to introduce the author here, which we normally would do, but that's because we're going to postpone the introduction of Ovid the author until after the midterm exam, when we read Ovid's much more prominent work, the Metamorphoses. The reason why I'm inserting this work here, the Heroides, is that we have here the theme of the heroine in Greek mythology, and now here in Roman mythology as well, that is the object of some type of mistreatment from some hero in either Greek or Roman mythology. And notice that even Roman mythology has an example of this quite notorious with Dido, and of course that's what we're going to be turning to next in the work of literature after this one, Virgil's Aeneid. So heroines have a tendency to be the women who in some way get in the way of the heroes, usually inadvertently. As such, they end up being somehow dispossessed, mistreated, pushed aside, abandoned, any other form of mistreatment that can possibly occur between the men and the women at this heroic status is what's going to occur to these particular women. What Ovid does in Heroides in quite a unique way is to give these women a voice by allowing them to write poetry that is going to express their angry feelings toward the men who have in some way trodden upon them. Now, there's several things to say about this before we get to the specific letters that you have assigned to read. First of all, the concept of a woman being able to write is in fact something that goes all the way back to Greek lyric poetry with the poetess Sappho, whom we made a reference to in connection with Catullus because of the similarity between two of Catullus's poems regarding Lesbia and one particular poem rather of Sappho's. So there already was a minor but nonetheless notable tradition of women being able to compose poetry. And then we also, of course, have the story of Phaedra, who herself writes a letter in Euripides' play Hippolytus, the tragedy about the way that she, the stepmother of Hippolytus, falls in love with him because of the instrumentation of the goddess Aphrodite, and then denounces him to her own husband Theseus by writing a letter. And the whole concept of writing a letter comes up in the big work Metamorphoses by Ovid with the character of Byblis, who falls in love quite illegitimately with her brother Caunus. And when that happens, her response to her feelings of being besmitten with her brother, again, is to write a letter. And writing a letter of this nature and disclosing her love for her brother of this type is of such ill omen that she actually drops the tablets when she tries to give them to a slave, and that signals that this whole transaction is not going to go well. So we have some traditions both before and after this composition suggesting that although it does not appear in very many places, that women could be associated with writing letters or other kinds of documents in some way. So that's the first thing to note. The second thing to note is that Ovid himself was a talented poet with love poetry, and in particular with the elegiac poetry that, other than Metamorphoses, he wrote quite profusely, including this work, which is also an elegiac work. Love poetry itself, in connection with the elegiac meter, was already well established from Hellenistic days, and frequently the poet writing the love poetry would often write long lamentations about how he was in love with some woman who was not paying any attention to him, and he wants her and all that type of stuff. And so Ovid himself was familiar with that tradition, as we know from his earlier work called the Amores. That's something that we're going to describe later when we get to Ovid fully. But what he now does is to write a kind of anti-love letter, essentially, basically turning the love letter on its heel and having the woman reject the man with the same elegiac form of the love letter. There are some later poems that in later centuries later that show examples of how a particular man will write a very complex poem to a woman trying to get her attention, and then the woman will write a poem in almost identical meter back to the man, basically rejecting point by point every single thing he says. So that tradition did get picked up by later poetry as well. So pay attention to the sort of anti-love theme aspects that come up in these letters as you go to complete your special project. Okay, so now let's talk about the stories in detail. The first one you have to read is Penelope, and Penelope is the wife of Odysseus, who is one of the heroes who travels to the Trojan War. He ends up with a fate of having to stay away for 20 years, and he in fact tries to dodge the draft, as it were, when the Greeks come to find him, by trying to pretend that he's gone mad and sowing his field all with salt. However, a guy named Palamedes tattles on him basically by grabbing the infant Telemachus out of Penelope's arms and putting the baby in front of the plow where Odysseus is plowing, and he immediately stops and grabs the baby and returns the baby to Penelope, and that of course shows that he's in fact sane and therefore that he must go on the war. Odysseus later finds a way to punish Palamedes by giving him a message that basically says, when the other guy receives the message, kill the guy who just brought you this message. So that takes care of Palamedes. Anyway, so Odysseus has been away for a very long time. It is described to us in Homer's Odyssey that Odysseus had consistent thoughts about attempting to get home to Penelope, despite the length of his journey home and despite the occurrences on the way home, such as with Circe and with Calypso and so on. But Ovid will have none of that. It is clear from the tone of the letter from Penelope to Odysseus that Penelope is quite suspicious of the fact that Odysseus has been away for so long. She's worried that she'll be an old woman by the time Odysseus ever does get home. She obviously doesn't know the length of time that's prescribed for him. And she, of course, is concerned that Odysseus may in fact have already been disloyal to her. And the movie that's based on Odyssey by Armand Assante has a really neat line in which Athena, played by Isabella Rossellini, tells Odysseus, "I know what you're really worried about with regard to when Odysseus is going to get home. You're worried that your wife Penelope has been untrue to you." And of course, that is Odysseus's ongoing concern, that one of the suitors that was occupying his house had in fact eventually gotten to Penelope. The question was, would in fact he discover that she had still had been waiting for him all that time when he got home? And you sort of wonder with this letter that maybe she is finally going to get really just ticked off and impatient if Odysseus doesn't show up soon and go and find somebody else. So that's this letter, and of these 6 letters, this is probably the most genteel and measured of the letters that we're going to say here. Deianira is the wife of the hero Heracles, or Hercules in Roman mythology. Hercules, of course, is the well-known hero with the 12 labors that he was forced to carry out as penance for the madness that hit his mind from Hera that caused him to murder his previous wife and children. So Deianira is the wife of Heracles because he wrestled her father, the river god Achelous, which is described to us in one of the myths in Ovid's Metamorphoses later. And so Heracles gets her hand and then takes her to a river where the centaur Nessus tries to carry her across the river, offers to do so, and then when he gets her in the middle of the river, he immediately tries to rape her. as the beast he is. And so Heracles shoots him with a poisoned arrow. He dies, but before he dies, as he's collapsing in the river, he tells Deianira, "Take my blood. It might be a love potion one day if your husband ever strays." So she takes it, believes him. Why she does is hard to say, but she does. And then later, Heracles, in one of his adventures, storms a city called Oikalia, and he falls in love with the princess of that city named Iole, and sends her, together with a group of other captive women, all home to Trachis, where he and Deianira live. When Deianira receives these captives, she is stricken by the especially beautiful and royal appearance of Iole, and then she discovers afterwards from a servant that Iole, in fact, has the potential to become the new wife of Heracles and will displace Deianira. That's what gets Deianira to send a coat all daubed with the poison of the blood of Nessus, and as a result, Heracles receives this wonderful coat. And then he goes to perform a sacrifice with a fire. He puts on the coat, and as the fire warms the coat, the poison seeps into his skin and starts to burn him alive. He ends up having a guy named Philoctetes actually set fire to a pyre and burn him alive. And Philoctetes receives the famous bow of Heracles that is unerring and can strike down any game that Philoctetes chooses. As a result of hearing what has happened, Deianira realizes her tragic blunder and ends up committing suicide. So in this letter, she's contemplating what might happen if in fact she ends up sending the poison off on the coat off to Heracles, and then realizes that her having done so is in fact tragic. Okay, now we have Phaedra. Phaedra is the sister of Ariadne, and as we mentioned, Phaedra is the second wife of Theseus, and therefore the stepmother of Theseus' son Hippolytus. And Phaedra is stricken in love by Aphrodite for Hippolytus, because Hippolytus is a devotee of Artemis, the hunt goddess, and refuses to worship Aphrodite. And so Phaedra first falls in love with Hippolytus. She gets rejected by him, and then she writes a letter to Theseus explaining exactly what's happened. So Phaedra is writing this letter in this poem to Hippolytus, and basically saying, I've written a letter to your father. What harm could a letter possibly do? Of course, as we well know from the tragedy of Euripides, quite a lot of harm, because that's what induces Theseus to call upon Poseidon after he expels Hippolytus, calls upon Poseidon to curse Hippolytus. And Poseidon sends up a bull out of the sea as Hippolytus is riding with horses along the seashore, and this bull that comes out of the sea scares the horses, and Hippolytus gets tangled up in the horses and will end up eventually dying. Okay, so that's Phaedra. Ariadne, of course, is well known with her connection with Theseus. She's the one that gives Theseus the string and the sword in order to allow him to, on Crete, to get through the labyrinth that's the part of the palace of Minos. That's Ariadne's father. And as he goes through the maze with the string and sword, he's able to dispatch the Minotaur, who ironically is Ariadne's half-brother, as it turns out. Ariadne then flees with Theseus, and Theseus takes her partway back to Athens, but then dumps her on the island of Dia, which was probably the island of Naxos in real geography. And as we saw in Catullus' poem 64, she curses him, and on his way home from that island to Athens, he forgets the promise he had made to his father to change his sail from the black sail of mourning to the white sail of celebration. And as a result, his father sees the black sail, not the white sail, and thinks that Theseus has died at the hands of the Minotaur, and throws himself over the cliff from Athens into the Aegean Sea, and that's how the Aegean Sea gets its name, as it turns out. So Theseus ends up cursed this way and does actually become king of Athens, but in a very bad way. Medea is the wife of Jason. Jason, of course, is the famous one of the Argonauts, the one who sails east to get the Golden Fleece. He has to do that because his uncle Peleus has demanded of him in the city Iolcus in Thessaly of Greece. And that's because Peleus has wickedly taken away the power from Jason's father Aeson, Peleus' brother, and now demands this tribute in order to get the rule back. So Jason travels over there on the Argo with a group of heroes. And when he arrives over to Colchis, he asks Aeetes, the king, for the golden fleece. Aeetes says, of course you can have the golden fleece. All you have to do is just sew these dragon teeth with those flaming bulls over there. Jason, of course, panics. However, Medea, once again, we have Aphrodite at work. Medea falls in love with Jason at the invitation of Aphrodite, and that's as a favor from Hera and and Athena, who both want to see Jason avenge Peleus because Peleus has previously dishonored both Hera and Athena. And so Medea falls in love with Jason and ends up helping Jason with a salve that goes on his body to yoke the two bulls and sew the dragon's teeth. And then Aeetes plots to kill Jason in the middle of the night. Medea learns this, and Medea gets Jason out of the palace, gets him over to the dragon, which is guarding the tree, and very wimpily puts the dragon to sleep by sprinkling it with poison, and then gets the fleece for Jason, and they sail off. When Aeetes the king pursues them, Medea gets a message to her brother Absyrtus to meet him on an island. And when Absyrtus arrives at the island, he comes into a shrine. Medea is there to meet him, and then suddenly Medea darts out of the way, and Jason comes out and strikes down brother Absyrtus. And then they dismember him and throw all the body parts into the water in order to stop the ships from sailing any further. When Medea and Jason arrive in Iolcus, Uncle Peleus now refuses to hand over the realm. It happens that Peleus has a number of daughters, and Medea coaxes the daughters into cutting up their father and putting him into a large cauldron of boiling water with a special salve that will rejuvenate him. And she demonstrates this on a ram. And so the daughters believe this, and they prepare the mixture, except that Medea switches it. And so when they cut Peleus down and throw him into the boiling water, of course nothing happens, and that's how Peleus is killed. As a result, Jason and Medea go into exile. They end up in Corinth, and it's there where Jason, who is up to this point has been, we'll call it, married to Medea sort of loosely, ends up abandoning Medea for the wife of, for a new wife, the princess of Corinth, whose name is Glauce or Creusa, depending on the version you read. And then Medea ends up in a fit of rage, avenging herself against Jason by killing first the bride and the bride's father Creon, and then also the two children that she and Jason had together as well, also suffer death, as is depicted in Euripides' tragedy, Medea. With this, we see how Medea basically trumps any effort of Jason to be first to be a proper husband to her, but then to be able to go on in life and find a new life for their children. She won't hear any of that. She's also a witch herself, so she's able to use the magic arts to be able to poison Creusa and the father Creon, and so that's how Jason ends up being brought down from Medea. So her murderous rage is what spills out in her letter before she carries out those acts of murder. And then finally we have Dido. I won't say too much about her now because I don't want to spoil her for when you go to read about Dido in Aeneid. But Dido, of course, is the queen of Carthage who encounters Aeneas as he flees from Troy to found the new city of Rome in Italy. He gets detained at Carthage because the goddess Juno, who is trying to block him because Juno doesn't want Rome to be founded because she's aware that Rome will eventually destroy Carthage, detains him in Carthage, as it turns out rather ironically, and then Juno and Venus arrange together for Dido and Aeneas to fall in love together, and it looks like there's going to be a marriage, but then the neighbor Iarbas, the king of Libya, complains strangely somehow to Jupiter. Somehow they know about Jupiter down there, and as a result, Aeneas ends up being forced to leave because Jupiter sends Mercury to tell him to leave. Thereafter, Dido, once she realizes that Aeneas is going to have to leave, contemplates and then actually carries out suicide. So she, just like Medea, writes a letter in this case, a suicidal rage against Aeneas, and then ultimately takes her own life. So those are the themes of the 6 letters. So make sure that you review them. They are very enjoyable to read. Of course, you need to know them well enough in case they become passages for your either midterm or final exam. And then select the letter that you would like to work on for your special project. Okay, and so later videos will cover some additional Roman history, and pretty soon we'll be ready to turn to our next work of literature, which is Virgil's Aeneid, one of the great masterpieces of Roman literature. We'll see you next video.